Sounds good. Yeah, we'll try to do a little before 12. See if we hit that mark. Okay, so this one, like I said, dovetails fairly nicely, but she's focusing predominantly on what's happening at a philosophical level. How's that affecting our kids? And her argument, as I said, is a little bit more convincing than Jonathan Haidt's. So it's not that I discredit what he's saying. I think that is definitely a factor, and there's a lot of reasons to believe that. But I also believe that what she's saying, what Abigail Schreier is saying, is more in line with what's actually going wrong. So the Bible talks a lot about this, and this is the main thing that the Bible does discuss, is that you got to remember the Bible was written over thousands of years, right? It's a long book. It took a long time for the Bible to be written, from the first book to the last book, from Genesis to Revelation. It covers a lot of human history. But you notice that it doesn't really, what's the best word? It doesn't really change its advice throughout. If you read Genesis to Revelation, you would think that the same culture wrote the Bible. But that's just not true, right? This is millennia of time spanning from the first book to the last book. These are many different technologies are coming up during that time span, many different cultures, right? Languages, everything is shifting, and yet the mainstream of the Bible stays the same. Because what the Bible is most concerned about, and what the Bible believes is most concerning, is not the technologies that exist inside of our world, which could be concerning in one way or another. What the Bible is most concerned about is the ideas that are taught in a given culture. That actually has much more to say with what's going wrong with us. So Abigail Schreier does a very good job of showing what are the ideas that we should be concerned about, and where are they, right? Where are they? First quote that I want to go over is Ephesians 6, verse 1 through 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you, and you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Now, what she's talking about in her book is how in our culture, I know it's a long quote, in our culture, what's happened that's most concerning is the fact that the role of the parent has been supplanted with something else. Now, this is something that happens every now and then, and we do see it happen in the Bible. What the Bible teaches is that, the old Pope had a really great word for this. I think it was called subsidiarity, which is awesome in my opinion. But what it means is that the Bible teaches a social structure that is built into different subsidiaries. So it's not one thing, it's many things that make up the fabric of a given society. And the main component of a given society is the family, right? And that's why Paul, when he's quoting Ephesians, when he's writing to the church of Ephesus, and he's talking about raising up your kids, right? He's talking about kids obeying their parents and dads not leading their children into wrath. He points out that is the first commandment with a promise, right? God actually tells his people that if they do this, it will be well with them within the land. And what Paul's pointing out is if that's true, then that means that the most important facet of a given society is the family. In the Bible, whenever a structure becomes too powerful and tyrannical, it starts to destabilize the family. And the Bible's very concerned about this, right? This is what's happening in the Tower of Babel, for instance, right? You have one central structure that's oppressing everything surrounding it. This is also what's happening in the book of Luke, right? So when you read the Gospel of Luke, and it's an interesting story, you're like, okay, so Jesus was born in a manger, and it's very romantic, and, in some ways, and his parents are driven out of their hometown of Nazareth. They have to go to Bethlehem. What's the significance of that? What's so important about that? Luke is commenting on the fact that the state had become so powerful that it could just arbitrarily move his citizens around. Does that make sense? That's how potent the state was. And the first act of tyranny that Jesus experiences is a tyrannical leader trying to exterminate the children in the given society, right? Because he's afraid about his own power. So the Bible is very concerned about any social structure that destabilizes the family and takes power away from parents in functioning within their own homes. That's mainly what Abigail Schreier is focusing on. What are these facets of our society, and why are they stealing power away from parents? Why are they telling parents that they don't have the right or the authority to parent their own kids? Here's another quote. I didn't put it up there, but I think it's fascinating. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God, for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 3 through 6. Most Christians, when they quote this, they see it as like spiritual warfare that's internal. That's not a bad way to interpret it, by the way. But the way that the earliest Christians interpreted this passage was, this is the warfare that the Christians are to fight. It is not a physical warfare. That's why the Christians didn't actually pick up swords and start fighting the Romans. It was a spiritual warfare, right? So there is a context in spiritual warfare that it goes a little bit beyond like demons and angels and things that we tend to think about. In their mind, spiritual warfare was going after the ideas that animated the society. The ideological fights. So when you look at the apostles, what were they doing? What were they spending their time doing? Arguing with people. That's what they spent all their time doing, is arguing with people. And the reason why they were doing that is because they realized what's breaking down our society, what's driving people away from God, is not, again, some of the things that we tend to fixate upon. Right? It's not the economy. It's not different social structures. What's really tearing apart our world are the ideas that animate our culture. So we have to take a step back. If we're going to fight the good fight as Christians, we have to realize what are the bad ideas that exist in our culture and what are they actually teaching us to do, and our kids. Okay? So let's go to, I got two more Proverbs that are really good and I think helpful for us. Proverbs 22, verse 15, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from them. What this proverb is saying is that kids innately don't know the right thing to do, and it is the job of the parent to try to teach them to do that. And we do use discipline in order to do that. Now, the big point, and this is a huge conversation that I could get into, I don't want to. The big point is that for our society, our social structure, it only works if the state doesn't have the ability to discipline its citizens. Now, be careful. The state can punish the citizens. That's what the state can do. They can legally punish us. They can send us to prison. Discipline insinuates not a punishment, but it insinuates, the discipline involves punishment. The purpose of discipline is actually to shape a child in a particular way. It's moral formation utilizing force. That's what discipline is. What our founders realized is it's a really bad idea to allow the state to have the right to discipline its citizens. Because that means that the state has an ideology that they're trying to shape the citizenry within. And once you give the state the right to discipline its citizens, you've basically given it total power, not just over your behavior, but over your thoughts and your heart. And that might be a really, really negative idea to give the state that kind of ability. Okay? But more and more people are wanting to give the state that ability, and that really is because of the destabilization of the home. So when the family is strong, people realize we don't want the state to have that authority because the parents are morally forming the children. When the family becomes weak, the state has to take up that role, and now the state is disciplining the citizens. The state is morally forming the citizenry. That also has to do with the church, because the church also had that role in the founders' conception of the state. But that's, again, a topic for another time. Proverbs 22, verse 28, do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. So once again, are these different problems? Yeah, they're different. But I'm philosophically conservative, which means that I believe that most of the answers that we need in our day-to-day life are found somewhere in the past. Right? So we do have different problems that are facing us, but it's not like the type or the principles change. Right? The principles remain the same, but the specifics are what are different. Okay? So let's go to our first quote. Let's start with parenting styles and why parenting styles have shifted over the years. So some of you guys have already probably heard or read this information, but I think it's good to reiterate. Investigation into parenting styles began with a brilliant psychologist of the 1960s named Diana Baumrind. After studying the ways parents attempt to control the behavior of their children, Baumrind discerned three general approaches: permissive, authoritative, and authoritarian. The permissive parent assiduously avoids punishment. She affirms the child's impulses, desires, and actions and consults the child about family decisions. She makes few demands on the child with regard to responsibilities and orderly behavior. She presents herself to the child as a resource for him to use as he wishes, not as an ideal for him to emulate, nor as an active agent responsible for shaping or altering his future behavior. Baumrind explains the authoritarian parent values a child's obedience as a virtue, holds a child's behavior to an absolute standard, works to keep the child in its place, restricts his autonomy, and does not ever encourage a give or take discussion about her rules. Neither approach produced particularly happy or successful adults. The authoritative parent, however, is loving and rule-based. She attempts to direct the child's activities in a rational manner, encourages a give and take with her child, but exerts firm control at points of parent-child divergence. Where her point of view on a household rule ultimately conflicts with that of her child, she wins. Okay? So this is actually the kind of parenting that the Bible suggests. So let's break these down a little bit more. Permissive parenting functions in the philosophical framework that's very popular in our day. So I can give you the whole etymology of this, but it really begins with a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You can look him up. He was a French guy, obviously. And he believed most of what we believe as Christians, because he's growing up in a mostly Christian venue, with one big exception. He denied original sin. He did not believe that human beings were originally sinful or fallen. He believed that we are born pure and good, and society corrupts us. This same framework was then picked up by a much more evil guy named Karl Marx 100 years later. But the basic fundamentals is that kids are not bad. Society makes them bad. Society is the problem. Kids are not the problem. So therefore, when you're raising your kid, you, having grown up in this corrupted society, are the problem. And you're going to give your bigoted, backwards ideas to your child. So wouldn't it be great if your kid was raised in an environment in which they were just permitted to do whatever they want? Then their purity would never be corrupted. So I, as a parent, shouldn't instill values into my child. I should instead try to get values from my child, because they speak in kind of the pure language of the cosmos, I guess, right? Now, modern teachers, we're going to talk more about this. This is where it's most prevalent, is in schools, right? This is idea of modern teaching functions off of this premise that parents are kind of the problem, and the kids are supposed to be divided from their parents so that they could grow up into who they need to be. Because again, the society is the problem, the kids aren't the problem. We need to break down the society so the kids grow up pure and basically, as our current vice president puts it, be unburdened by what has been, right? To move past what has been, because that was all a mistake, and we need to move forward into the future so that we can move out. So again, people make fun of her for being incoherent. She's actually coherent, right? She's very coherent. Her ideology is bad and incoherent, but she's coherent. When she keeps saying we need to go forward, that's what she means. We need to get away from the past, because the past is what's drowning us and corrupting our children. We need to move forward into a beautiful utopia in the future, which we can construct through the children. Right? This is why they elevated people like Greta Thunberg to speak about climate action. It's because from the mouth of babes, praise is perfected. They perverted that verse, because a lot of it's a heretical Christian view. They perverted that verse and they said, therefore, kids speak the truth all the time, right? They speak what is accurate. And it's us adults that need to get behind the kids. Okay, that's permissive parenting, and it doesn't work for that reason. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of your child. Your child does not know what's best for them. They're going to, if you give them unlimited autonomy and you let them do whatever they want to do, if you allow them to self-identify however the heck they want to self-identify, they're going to be very confused. They need some sort of an authoritative figure to help them orient themselves within the world. Okay? But what permissive parenting is a reaction to is the kind of parenting that a lot of us grew up with, authoritarian parenting. So authoritarian parenting is kind of like the boomer generation, right? This is the idea that there's a law out there, but I don't want you to really know the law. I want you to fear me, right? So I want you to listen to me, and that's where you're getting your worldview. That's where you're getting your ideology. In fact, it's insulting to me that you do the right thing because it's the right thing. I want you to do the right thing because I told you to do it. Right? This is kind of the ultimate negative idea of because I said so. Right? It's you should do it because I said so. That's it. It ends with me. What authoritative parenting is attempting to do is the middle of the two. Is it saying there is a law out there? There's a law out there that I am submissive to and that you are submissive to. And I am just here to help make that law come a little closer. I'm here to just manifest that law to you in a way you can understand it. So let me give you an example. Lying is a problem. Okay? There is a law in the universe that lying is bad. Okay? Because God has oriented the universe in relation to his character, and God is truth. So when we lie, if we grow up and we become liars, the consequence is that people don't trust us. And people don't like us. And people don't want to do anything with us because we're liars. We can't be trusted. You cannot develop successful relationships if you are dishonest. If you're chronically dishonest, you will not develop successful relationships. However, that law is way too high and distant for a kid to understand. You are not going to be able to explain that to a 3-year-old. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to say, hey, daughter, one day you're going to want to have a successful marriage. And if you're a liar, no one's going to want to marry you, right? She's not going to get that. So instead, there needs to be a consequence that brings near the law of God, that helps her understand, look, this discipline, this is not your consequence. This is a representation of the consequence. Does that make sense? So the permissive parent is saying, I don't want to give them any consequence because the way they are is just great. And maybe I'm the one who needs to change. So I'm just going to talk to my child and help coddle them and make them turn into the person they want to be. The authoritative parent is saying, I need to bring consequences into my child's life so that they are submissive to me. The authoritarian parent is saying, what is the best way for me to help my child understand consequences in the grand scale? And I'm going to use discipline to do that. So how much discipline do we use? Using the gardening analogy again, depends on the kid. It depends on the kid. It depends on what you're doing. But it should be, and I like this phraseology, minimum necessary involvement. Minimum necessary involvement is the best way to look at it. As a parent, I am supposed to impose myself the minimum necessary amounts of time. If I'm maximizing my involvement, I'm not allowing my child to learn lessons. I'm actually stopping them from learning lessons because now they're only relating to me as opposed to the actual framework of reality. And what that's actually doing is it's making them vulnerable to then believe somebody else later on as the new authoritative figure. Does that make sense? So you're like, why are all these kids going to colleges and get brainwashed? Well, it's because you raise them in an authoritative manner, and now they're looking for a new authoritative figure to help them orient themselves to the world. They don't understand the world. They only understand that dad's always right. Right? And then when they become teenagers, they start to believe that dad's always wrong, and then they start to believe whatever professor or boyfriend or girlfriend is then telling them, or social media influencer is telling them, and that becomes their new North Star, and their whole worldview changes. Okay? If the child is supposed to be ready to enter the world, they have to understand for themselves what is right and what is wrong. Minimum necessary involvement within a child's life helps do that. This is also why it's bad to interfere with kids in playing. When kids play, right, it's so tempting as a parent when they start getting into a fight to step in. What that's doing is it's showing them, I make the rules. I'm the authority here. I make the rules. You need to share with your sister because I said so. Right? What kids need to realize is they need to realize, why do we share? Why do we reciprocate? Because no one wants to play with you if you're a jerk. That's why. No one wants to share toys with you if you're going to hog everything. And if I step in every single time, again, what goes into my kid's head is, dad is a jerk. He won't let me do what I want. So when he's not looking, I'm going to do it a lot more. Right? What you want is your kid to learn the lesson to such an extent that when you are not looking, they will do the right thing. because it's the right thing. The more you involve yourself, the less likely it is that they will ever learn that lesson. But if you don't involve yourself at all, they also will not learn that lesson. It's minimum necessary involvement. That's a good way to put it. I just put this one in here to be contrarian. The au-courant idea that even humane punishments don't work is something Baumrind calls a myth. Baumrind also found that demands for neatness in children is associated with less hostile and less delinquent kids, and that it is incorrect to assume that high expectations would result in passive-aggressive rebellion. While Baumrind did not advocate spanking, she found that occasional mild spanking did not traumatize children. Cue the outrage. But it's true, studies have been unable to support supposed links between spanking and externalized disorders. So whatever the minimum necessary involvement is, sometimes could, for some children, potentially involve spanking. The problem is that if I'm an authoritative parent, this is what usually is pointed out about spanking problems. If I'm an authoritative parent, the spanking is what's culling the behavior. Does that make sense? I am intimidating my children into right behavior, and I want them to be afraid of me, right? And the spanking does that. So if it's authoritative parenting and you're using spanking in that way, it will be bad. But if you're using it in a different way, it may not be. The other important thing I want to point out about that, though, is this idea of passive-aggressive rebellion. Where does that come from? Okay, so let me use an example that most people are aware of. I can't believe I'm spacing on the word. When they got rid of alcohol, what was that called? Yes, yeah. So when that happened, everyone knows that that didn't go well, right? So when they got rid of all alcohol, they're like, this is going to fix the drinking problem. It didn't really work. The reason why is because the law, whatever the law is, it has to in some way cooperate with the conscience. Okay? So if the conscience is not prepared for a law, it will have an adverse effect. So let me give you an example, and this is what Thomas Aquinas says. You don't have to remember this. But he says, whenever someone institutes a human law, the human law has to cooperate with the conscience. If the law is too high, although it's good, it will have an adverse effect. If the law is too low, it won't actually make the conscience higher. The law must be the right level for the conscience that it's given to. Now, this is what he means. Okay? Let's say I have a kid that wants to date. Okay? They want to date. And I, as a parent, start talking to my kid, and I realize this kid's going to date no matter what I do. They're going to do it. They're going to call it something else to get around it. You'd be like, oh, we're just really good friends, and we just, have some certain qualities to our relationship that are different than most, right? They're going to be clever about it, but they're going to do it no matter what. I have a choice at that point. I could either be the authoritative parent and say, no, and I'm going to move you schools, and I'm going to do everything I can to keep you away from that boy. Okay? You can do that. It's probably going to have an adverse effect, though, because you're not cooperating with the conscience of your child. You're doing something that's adverse to their conscience, and so it's going to destabilize your relationship, and it's going to make it more likely that they rebel. However, if you say, okay, what's a law that I can give? I don't like it, but what's a law that I can give that can at least protect them? Okay, so I say, okay, you could date that boy, but you have a curfew, something like that. Okay, and if you make the curfew like 5 p.m, again, it's probably not going to work. You got to make it something where it's like they'll actually obey it. They will actually listen to this law because it's low enough that they could access, but it's high enough that it will, as after time of her obeying it, it will hopefully start showing her why dad has this rule in the first place, right? So it's, again, this idea of minimum necessary involvement allows for the child to develop their own conscience, okay? Again, there's more I could talk about. Now let's talk about her main thrust of the book, therapy in the new generation. So where is this all coming from? Back in the day, there was a class of individuals that all societies basically called them the priest class, right? And the purpose of the priest class was to be a mediator between the divine and the human, right? They were somewhere in the societal role as helping people understand divine truths or divine principles and bringing them down to people so that they can understand them on a practical level, right? So the law was all practical. And then you have other religious texts that are all theological. The priests were supposed to mediate between those two things, if that makes sense. As our society became increasingly materialistic, the priest class died, right? It just went away. And what took its place, this is what Abigail Schreier argues, this is also what Carl Jung argued would happen. What took its place is the psychiatric industry, if you want to word it that way, right? So psychiatrists have become the new priest class. They are the experts who sit in some sort of an ivory tower and explain to us what it means to live our lives correctly. And they're honored in that way. Now, what she does is she points out it's not a direct attack against psychology. It's like everything else we're talking about. There's nothing wrong with psychology in and of itself. But it was designed for a particular thing. And once you take something that was designed for a limited function and you expand it to something it was never intended to do, it becomes really destructive. So psychiatry, it works great in the limited scope that it was given, right? For people who have definitive mental illness, things that are actually wrong, that are destabilizing them, psychiatry worked great. Pastors, people like that, they dealt with other stuff, right? So when you went in and you talked to your priest in the Catholic Church, or maybe a pastor in your local church or whatever, and they helped give you counsel or advice, that's different. So you'd realize someone who has, let's say, intensive bipolar disorder, or maybe schizophrenia or something like that, where they're non-functional, that's the psychiatrist's job. But someone who needs advice about, where to move or something like that, or something basic, go talk to a pastor. Go talk to your family. Go talk to an older friend, a cool aunt, someone in your life that you respect their maturity and will help you make those decisions. That's the idea of counsel. When you read the book of Proverbs and it talks about counsel, those who do not heed counsel are stupid, right? It's pretty blunt. That's the idea of counsel, is giving advice. That's what it is. What the psychiatric community has become is kind of all of that. It's not just mental illness anymore. By basically diagnosing the whole populace, we all have a mental illness of some sort, and therefore they could speak into every facet of our lives. That's where it's become problematic. And that's where, again, the government, the state, which is now responsible for the education of these people, now the state actually has power to govern our psychological states. Okay? So when people are freaking out, like, how could this happen? That parents could be separated from their kids if they don't believe in their gender identity. This is a facet of what happens when the state has the ability to discipline. When the state is looking at it and saying, no, we are now telling you what ought to happen, what is morally right. And we're listening to the experts. Well, what are the experts? The experts are the priest class that exists underneath the government. They've become kind of one thing. So it sounds like there's objectivity, but there's really not. That's kind of like if I tell my daughter to do something, and she's like, but Dad, I don't like that. I'm like, well, let's go talk to a mother expert. And I go and talk to her mom. Well, you see, Mom agrees with me, so you should really do what I'm saying. It has the appearance of objectivity because I'm going to another source of information, but really Mom and Dad are kind of one thing. We're one power structure. So there's like an appearance of objectivity of, well, we're just listening to the doctors. Well, the problem is that the doctors are being educated by state-run universities. So is it really that objective? No, it's kind of the same thing, and that's the big problem that's going on. So she's just trying to bring that down. She's not criticizing therapy. She's criticizing its overusage in our culture. That's what she's criticizing. Now, the first thing that she points out is something that most therapists won't tell you. It's this term called iatrogenesis, which means harm that begins with the healer. Okay? Well-meaning therapists often act... Sorry, I keep forgetting to do this. Is that the right one? Did I skip that one? Okay, I'm sorry. I skipped that one. I'll just read it. So it says, well-meaning therapists often act as though talking through your problems with a professional is good for everybody. That isn't so. Nor is it the case that as long as the therapist is following protocols and has good intentions, the patient is bound to get better. Any intervention potent enough to cure is also powerful enough to hurt. Therapy is no benign folk remedy. It can provide relief. It can also deliver unintended harm and does so in up to 20% of patients. So if you have a headache today and you take a Tylenol, That has the power to help you, but it also has some side effects to taking that pill. It's not inane. There is no such thing as an intervention in your life that has no power to harm you. A big deception that the psychiatric community was able to give to the people is to believe that they cannot do harm. That, like, if I send my kid to this counselor, there's no way that they can hurt them. It only has a net benefit. Worst case scenario is that they don't get any better, but best case scenario is they get a lot better. That's just not true. When you go and you talk to someone about a problem, whether it's me or anyone else, the advice that I give you has the power to hurt or to help. That's what it is, right? So if you actually follow what I'm telling you to do, and I tell you the wrong thing, it doesn't matter how well-meaning I am. If I focus on things that I shouldn't be focusing on, if I misdiagnose, if I say something wrong, or if I go about it in an inappropriate manner, all those things have the potential to hurt the people that I'm speaking to. But what the psychiatric community has been able to do very slyly is to present themselves as infallible authorities, that they can't be wrong because they're backed by the science. Okay, so this is Proverbs 19, verse 20 through 21. Listen to counsel and receive instruction, that you may be wise in the latter days. There are many plans in a man's heart, nevertheless, the Lord's counsel that will stand. Now, the reason why that one is so important, gosh, I skipped that one too. I'm sorry, I failed you guys. The reason why that one's so important is because counsel is a good thing, but that counsel has to participate in the higher counsel of God. Right? In other words, that it has to, in some way, be aligned with God's good counsel. This is, again, a big disagreement that happened in the early days of psychiatry between Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. Right, so Sigmund Freud, he was presenting, because he was a materialist. He believed that we were all basically just matter. We didn't have a soul. So he started to take all the concepts of Christianity that he was raised in, and he started to medicalize it. So when you talk about the ego, the id, the superego, and all the other theories that Freud had, most of them are brilliant, but all of them were attempts to take spiritual things, things that were in the sphere of spirituality, and move them into the sphere of material. And Jung was very nervous about that. He didn't like that. He thought that Freud was absolutely brilliant, but he was very worried that as Freud went the direction he was going, he was presenting himself as a new priest class. And when he accused Freud of doing that, Freud said, well, yeah, it's exactly what we are. He's like, yeah, we're developing a new orthodoxy. And Jung was very uncomfortable with that, right? He was not very comfortable with Freud saying that because he thought that that was going beyond the sphere. In his own book, Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, which is a fantastic book, by the way, he says that he was shocked at how many Christians sent people to him to counsel. And he's like, why are you coming to me for counsel? You realize I don't believe what you do, right? So yeah. And Jung wasn't an atheist, by the way. He was a religious guy. He did believe in God. He did believe in some concept of God. We would call him somewhat heretical, but he did have some concept of spirituality, and he did value and venerate the scriptures to a much higher extent than most modern psychologists do. But ultimately, he was like, you need to go talk to a spiritual leader. They're going to have much better information for you on this. Right? So he was about narrowing the scope of psychiatry. Freud was about broadening it. Right? Broadening it out so that we could get rid of the religious pastoral class, which he thought was actually bad for people. The next one is Proverbs 3, verse 19. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. Proverbs 3, verse 19. So that's once again saying that God has used wisdom to design the universe. It functions off of his principles. So again, it does actually matter what your psychiatrist believes. Now this is, again, it sounds kind of controversial because most people, when they think of psychiatrists, they think they're doctors, which they are. They do have a doctorate and they do function within, as Carl Jung put it, the intersection point between the body and the soul, right, which is the mind. So there is something material about our thoughts. There is something material about our thoughts and the way that we think. But there's also something spiritual about it. And you got to put the two together. And it really does matter what your psychologist thinks about these things. By believing that they're doctors in the sense of like a medical doctor, we've kind of mixed things up. So a medical doctor, it's like, does it matter what your medical doctor believes when they're working on, say, your arm? right? If a doctor's going to put your arm in a sling, you'd be like, whoa, 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 what do you believe about God? I don't know if I want you touching my body unless I know what you believe about the supernatural, right? That would be ridiculous because he's only working on something material. Your arm is purely matter, and therefore there's a very definitive way it ought to function. I don't really care what my doctor believes when he's setting my arm. However, once he's setting your mind, then you should probably care. You should probably care what he thinks about these things. Because the way that he sets your mind is the way that your mind's now going to function. If you listen to his counsel, that's now the way you're orienting yourself towards the world. What parents have done, and I think this is really fascinating, is that because parents have been taught by this expert class that you should doubt your instincts and you should be worried because you were traumatized by your parents and you don't want to traumatize your kids, we're so nervous that we're willing to give up our authority as parents to someone else, to the state, and say like, yeah, you guys raise my kids. Like I'm good with that. You guys are free daycare. I'm going to send you guys to school and they're going to raise my kids for me. And I'm totally comfortable with that because they're teaching you the right thing. There's a comfortability that parents have in sending their kids out because they feel inadequate to do things within the home. Now, this is also a breakdown of intergenerational knowledge, right? That usually when people were raising kids back in the day, you know who they would ask? They would ask grandma. They would ask grandpa, how did you guys raise us? We survived, you know? Like maybe you guys got some wisdom to give us. We're alive. You raised a couple kids. You know, how does that really work? But now we have such a negative view of the past that we're like, oh, those people didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know about this stuff, this modern genius things. It's like, okay, well, we've had this modern way of looking at kids for not very long. How have we done? Okay, so you could criticize all these backward people. You could go to like Papua New Guinea or Africa and something like that, and you can see how they're raising their kids. Like, oh, how backwards! Look at the way they yell at their children and they smack them. That's so terrible. Thank God that we have evolved beyond. How are our kids turning out compared to their kids? Okay, if we had really figured it out, and we're so superior to them, you would expect our culture to be way superior to their culture. There aren't many cultures that have a suicide rate that ours does with teenagers. It's just not really there. Okay, so we're obviously doing something wrong. We should try to figure out what that is. Okay, but it's this advice coming from this new priest class that has reduced everyone down to matter, and that's the big problem. Okay, Proverbs 18 verse 17 says, the first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes out and examines him. Okay, when all you're exposed to is one side of the argument, it seems kind of right. All I'm trying to do in this session is just presenting maybe a different perspective that you may not have heard before. Okay. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay. So this is, I love this one as a pastor. I read this one a lot as a pastor. Obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give an account. But let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. Okay? As a pastor, I read that one a lot because I'm like, am I joyous when I'm ministering to people? Or am I like, ministry is great if it wasn't for the people, Parenting works the same way. There's a big reason why the modern generation does not want to have kids and why they're listening to the lies of the antenatal movement that's going on in our culture right now is because we've made parenting look so dang miserable. We've made it look so dang miserable. And it's so easy. We think we're immune to this. It is so easy to resent your kids. It is so easy to resent your kids. And one of the main ways that you can start resenting your kids is if your kids start absorbing more and more of your life into themselves. I've said this, kids are like black holes. They will take as much attention as you are willing to give them. They will not say stop. They will never say, hey mom, that's enough attention. I don't need any more. I'm good. I'm going to go play on my own. You don't have to pay attention to me anymore. Kids just won't say that. They'll say that when they want a little bit of free time, but they're not going to say that in the context of attention. They will take as much attention as you are willing to give them. The benefit of older parents is that older parents just had way too much to do to give their kids unlimited attention, right? They had to make everything from scratch and sew all the holes and do all this crazy stuff. And so they're like, I don't have time to give you unlimited attention. I only have a small amount of attention to give you, and I will give it to you, but that's it. That's all I got. Now we have so much time as parents that we really can give them all of our attention. And once you start giving your kid all of your attention and they take more and more and more of it, they become a little monster, right? So when kids are taught, they innately believe this, that they are the center of the universe. If you start feeding into that delusion of like, yeah, you kind of are the center of the universe, let's make everything about you, it's just going to make them a little tyrant. That's it. And they will then demand everybody to treat them as the center of the universe. So that's actually a really negative thing for them to do. So again, the new generation sees parents just worn out, just absolutely worn out. And in their minds, they think, look at what I'm doing for my child. I'm giving them way more attention and affection than my parents ever gave me. You're doing that, but you may not be doing the best thing. You may not be doing what's right for you and what's right for your children by draining yourself of your identity. I say this all the time, but this is actually, I just bought this for my kids. I found like an original version of Hansel and Gretel. Such a good story. That's what Hansel and Gretel is about. Next time you read Hansel and Gretel, that is literally what that book is about. It's about it's an overly indulgent mother who feeds her kids and then feeds on them, right? So they go to the witch's house, and what is it? It's made out of gingerbread. Everything you want, kid. Everything is edible around you. But then they realize later that she's fattening them up so that she might feed on them later on. A parent that gives their kid everything is a parent that's going to need reciprocation at a certain point. They are more your emotional support than anyone else. Call that a surrogate spouse. Okay. We've already kind of gone over a lot of these points. We've only got 5 minutes left. So let's see. Let's talk about meditation for a second. Christian meditation. Okay. Individual therapy can intensify bad feelings. Psychiatrist Samantha Boardman wrote candidly about a patient who quit therapy after a few weeks of treatment. All we do is talk about the bad stuff in my life, the patient told Boardman. I sit in your office and complain for 45 minutes straight. Even if I'm doing good, having a good day, coming here makes me think about all the negative things. Reading that, I remembered saving up emotional injuries to report to my therapist so that we would have something to talk about at our session. Injuries I might have just let go. Okay. There's a principle in the Bible that what we behold, we become. This is 2 Corinthians 3, verse 18. Beholding as in a mirror the glory of God, we are becoming like him. Okay? What you behold, you become. In our current culture, what the therapeutic industry is teaching people is to focus acutely on their emotions at all times. Your mental health is very vital. Think about your emotions. Think about your mental health. Think about what's going on internally. And as I said before, there is really no distinction between anxiety and self-focus. The more focused you are on yourself, the more anxious you become. Okay? A good definition of anxiety, by the way, is an inability to commit to the present moment. It's when your attention is divided elsewhere, right? You're not here. You're thinking about what could go wrong tomorrow or what went wrong yesterday. You're not really thinking about what's going on right now in front of me. This is why Jesus, when he's talking about anxiety, what does he say? Sufficient for today are the troubles therein. Okay? So he's not saying don't plan, but he is saying the more you're disconnected from the present moment, the less likely you are to have internalized peace. You have to be present. The more you have people focus inwards, those emotions are anchored to something else, right? If you're thinking about, oh, I'm upset, well, then the next question is, why are you upset? At any given moment in any given moment in any day, you have at least 20 reasons to be upset, angry, and sad. Okay? But you also have reasons to be happy. And if all you focus on is all the reasons you have to be upset, then guess what? You're just going to be upset all the time. This is Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Paul wrote that in prison, right? So he wasn't exactly riding on the hog and things were going great. He wrote that in prison. What's happened is that our entire culture has become one giant therapy session. Okay, so what happens is kids go onto TikTok and YouTube and they look up influencers that are teaching them to get more involved with their emotional state. Then they go to school, and in school they have something called social emotional learning. Moving aside the fact that that Castle, the company that actually developed this program, is full-on Marxist, let's move that aside for a second. Social emotional learning is just bad for you, because what it's doing is it's taking every lesson and moving it into the emotional realm. So it's saying like, okay, we're going to talk about math, but we're also going to talk about how math makes you feel, right? And that sounds like a gross oversimplification, because it kind of is, but it's also a little bit of what's actually happening. Okay, so social emotional learning is teachers allowing students to fixate upon their emotional states throughout the day. And that's a moving target, right? To ask someone how they feel is a very loaded question. And bad therapists don't know how to hone in or mine out what the emotions are that we should be focusing on in a given session. So when I counsel someone, my job is not just to let them vent for an hour. That's not my job. It's to orient their thoughts towards something productive, so that when they leave the session, they start doing something different, right? But talk therapy, which is what a lot of therapy has become nowadays, is literally just venting. This is Proverbs 29, verse 11. A fool vents all of his feelings, but a wise man holds them back. Socrates once famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And that's a good phrase, especially to people who are emotionally cut off and shallow. However, the unlived life is not worth examining. Okay? So if you spend all your time just examining your emotional state and you're not living, you're not actually doing anything. So if I spend my entire day getting nothing accomplished, and I'm like, why am I so depressed? Maybe it's because you spent your whole day not doing anything. That's kind of depressing, right? To see dishes pile up and to see chores go undone and to realize I have a bunch of things to do to get my life together and I haven't done any of them. Why not? Because I'm trying to get my mental health in order. Well, your mental health is deteriorating because you're not doing anything for your physical life. So your mental health is now looking back at the lack of accomplishment within your life, and you're becoming more depressed and sorrowful. So the balance that we're trying to achieve, and this is what she's talking about, again, it's not that it's bad. It's not that it's bad to talk about your feelings, but there's a time and a place. There's a time and a place to do that. Your life cannot revolve around your mental health. And that is exactly what we're teaching young people to do, that your mental health is the most important thing, and everything that happens has to be in relation to that, the way that you're feeling, as opposed to, again, what you're doing. The Bible is an action-oriented book. Does that make sense? The Bible is an action-oriented book. It's not an emotionally oriented book. There are parts of the Bible that do focus on the emotions, predominantly the book of Psalms. But the majority of the book of the Bible, which is why we think it's backwards, is action-oriented. Do this, don't do this. Like, oh, it's so oppressive. The thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. What the Bible is saying is, again, you're an embodied soul. The way that your soul does has a lot to do with how your body is doing. If your life is in disarray, you can't really expect your internal life to be in perfect harmony. Okay? Once again, there's much more I could say about that. Let me end it this way, though. Mental health. Let's talk about a little bit of mental health. So Thomas Zass, you can look this up later, wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness. I don't fully agree with this premise, but one of the things he mentions is that the term mental illness is itself a misnomer. Okay, because when we use the term mental illness, what we're suggesting is that the mind can get sick the same as the body. And on that one premise comes the overdiagnosis that's happened. Because that means that anytime your mind is not doing what you think it should, you might be sick in some way. You might have an anxiety disorder, or ADHD, or a depressive disorder, or something like that. It is so easy to diagnose people with these various disorders, right? Any one of you could get diagnosed today if you wanted to. It's very, very easy to do that. The problem is that when we say mental illness, it does two things that are both bad. The first thing is it puts you out of control of your own life. right? By calling something an illness, it means that you have no autonomy over your mental state. Okay? You don't have control if you have a cold. That's just it. If you have a fever, you can't be like, well, you have weak willpower, man. You need to get over that fever. That's a ridiculous statement. Obviously, if you have a fever, that's it. You have no control. It's just going to happen. Okay? If I use the term mental illness, that insinuates to someone that you have no autonomy over your mental illness. None. I believe mental illnesses are real. However, I also believe that we have autonomy within our lives. The more that we treat mental illnesses like physical illnesses, the more we take autonomy and personal responsibility out of our vocabulary. That's a very bad thing. The second thing that's problematic is that it insinuates that it can just happen to you. Right? So if like my wife's sick today. Now, none of you are going to treat that as if she did something sinful or wrong, right? I'm going to be like, well, what was your wife doing that she's sick? What was she doing that she's sick now? I mean, maybe during COVID people would talk like that, but hopefully nowadays people are moved around that kind of stuff. What was she doing? You'd be like, she got sick. Who knows how she got it? We were in the elevator. We were in the airport the other day. I don't know. She could have caught it from any of the thousands of strangers that we came in contact with. I don't know why she's sick. Mental illness kind of works the same way. Mental illness oftentimes is not a disease of the mind, it's a disease of the will. It's an inability to control yourself. That's what it is. That's not contagious. That's not something you just pick up randomly. It does have a lot to do with the way that you think and the kinds of thoughts that you're allowing into your mind and the kinds of ways that you're responding to them. And I have to tell these people all the time, you do it every day. You control your emotions every day, all the time, without even knowing it. They take driving, for instance. We are not really designed to go at those speeds. I don't know if you knew that, right? We're just not designed to go at those speeds. But we do it so often that we don't even think about it. Do you remember the first time you got behind the wheel, though, and how nervous you were? Okay, every single day, whether you realize it or not, negative, anxious thoughts start coming into your brain when you get behind the wheel. Every day. But they don't go anywhere because you've conditioned yourself to suppress them. You overcome your anxiety every single day, all the time, in numerous different ways. We were just on a plane going to Phoenix, and which is stupid. Just me saying that. It was like a 10-minute flight. We went up and we went down. But we went to Phoenix because Tucson doesn't have flights to Minnesota. That plane felt like it was going to fall apart, right? And we were going up and down. It was going all over the place. And everybody was just kind of like laughing about it. Okay? The reason why is because it's become so common to us that we're like, yeah, I don't have to be afraid about this. It's okay. I could put it to the side. When you use mental illness, it's like you can't really control an illness. It's just the way you are, right? You catch it, and it's not your fault, and you perpetuate the symptoms, and it's not your fault. The idea of mental illness is there is a level of autonomy. If you start developing negative thought patterns, that does have a level of autonomy within your life. And if you entertain those thought patterns, they become stronger. And if you fight them, they become weaker. But if we use this language, once again, we're removing autonomy from the populace. So again, I have a lot more to say about that, but let's break for lunch. And again, if you have any questions about stuff I went over, please ask them. Me and Lisa are going to be hanging out in the front in, I don't know, when did we start the last session, Randy?